brothers. It's good to be together. Again, I am Ryan Painter for all those who are watching online, and welcome to our men's midweek service. We're going to continue with our theme of beneath the surface, and we're going to just continue marching through the Gospel of Matthew. We're in the Sermon on the Mount right now, and we're going to pick it up in Matthew chapter 7, and we get to read about some of the most quoted words from, actually probably the most quoted verse of Scripture from non-Christians that you're ever going to find. And that's in Matthew chapter 7. I'm going to pick it up here in verse 1. Jesus says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' while all the time there was a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, you actor. First, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet, and turn and tear you to pieces." Fun. Okay. So, like I said, this is one of the most quoted, well-known passages in the world today. It sort of serves the world as a get out of an uncomfortable conversation card. You know, like when the heat's on and you're getting it, this is the go-to when it comes to, well, let's just, let's distract everyone and, get them off my back here. And so we say, "Oh, do not judge, or you too will be judged." It's the go-to scripture for the defensive-minded person. But what does Jesus really mean when he says these words, "do not judge"? And so the word judge in the English language has just a variety of different meanings. I mean, there's all kinds of different meanings and nuances to the word judge. And actually the same is true in the Greek. The Greek word for this, for the word judge, it's the Greek word krino. And it simply means to distinguish or to decide, okay? So it's making a choice. It's not necessarily it could be a moral choice, but it doesn't have to be a moral choice. What do you like on your pizza? Krino, okay? You've got to make a judgment, a distinction, and give your answer. What team do you root for? Krino. What shirt are you going to wear today? I'm wearing my dad shirt, straight up plaid here, loving it. Okay. Krino. And so there you go. So that's kind of the baseline understanding of this word, judge. Well, clearly we have to make judgments in our life, and Jesus is fine if we're, choose pepperoni or whatever it is that we're going to choose for our pizza. I guess the Jews probably wouldn't do pepperoni, but anyway, get vegetables. Jesus would be good at that. Anyway, but so it's not that. Jesus isn't saying, well, you can't make any form of judgment. I mean, that's obviously ridiculous. And so what are some other judgments that are out there? Well, there's the judicial system that we use. And whether you call it the judicial system or, you could be having some type of the dunk contest, okay? They have their panel of judges. Well, it could also obviously be used in that context. And for a judicial system, that's rendering a verdict of someone else's guilt or of their innocence, what type of judgment you're going to be putting on them. Is this what Jesus is talking about here? No, this is not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is not trying to end the judicial system, within Judaism. He's not talking about that. Another idea here is that judgment could be this idea of discernment. Discernment. And the discerning are actually very much lifted up in the scriptures. Those who are discerning, that has great spiritual value. If you look in the Proverbs, 15 times they call the wise person in the Proverbs a discerning person. In other words, the ability to tell right from wrong. The ability to say, this is a good situation that I'm going to get myself into, or a bad one. Discerning can also, it's not always right and wrong. Discerning kind of also can be what's better and what's best. Typically when you have elders, when you have shepherds, you want them to be very discerning, just to be able to kind of give good input and good advice. And so, in the scriptures, we're supposed to be discerning. Philippians chapter 1, verse 9 and 10, Paul says this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ. Okay, now I don't think Jesus is talking about this form of discernment when he says do not judge. He's not saying do not have any form of discernment. Just do whatever you want. There is no right and wrong. I don't think clearly that's what Jesus is saying. And obviously when you get to this thing, you realize that when he's talking about judgment, he's actually talking about it in the context of judging another person. So while the first three words simply say do not judge, or you too will be judged, rather, in verse 2, it says, for in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And so the type of judgment isn't like a discerning, like what's best. It has to do with a judgment towards others. And so it does have to do with, or it could have something to do with the discernment that comes towards other people. And so this is where it gets a little dicey, because what some people want to do, the defensive-minded person, what he wants to do with this scripture is he wants to be able to eliminate himself from any form of correction from his brothers. In other words, he wants to remove himself from the whole discipling process, at least when the heat is on. I mean, that's just a good go-to, you're judging me. But I don't necessarily think that that's even what Jesus is condemning, because Jesus did that all the time with his disciples, right? He's always discerning what is best for them and letting them know when they've made the wrong move. We also see in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 12, we see an actual command that Paul gives to the Corinthian church about the need to enact judgment on a brother. And it says here, what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. And so discerning, when you're kind of taking your discernment and putting it on someone else, to do that within the church is actually noble. But when we start to do that with those outside the church, that's where it can go. That's where things can get a little bit funky. And more on that. But this idea of discipling is clearly very, very biblical. Hebrews 3, verse 12, see to it, brothers, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. To determine that somebody has a sinful or an unbelieving heart and that they're in danger or jeopardy of turning away from the living God, that takes discernment. That takes a level of judgment, and we are to make that judgment and communicate that judgment. So within the church, that's all good. But I think there's another form of judgment here that I really do think that Jesus is talking about, and that's the judgment of value. How much value do you put on something? Okay? So when I go to the grocery store and milk is $2.29 a gallon, I'm actually probably going to grab 2 gallons. At $2.29, I'm going to grab 2 gallons because I'm that value of a gallon of milk, $2.29, that fits, we're good to go. Okay? If we're in a hurry, though, and I stop at the convenience store or the gas station, and that's a jug of milk is $4.99, well, it's not worth that to me. So I'm either going to not get it, or if I absolutely have to have it because, wife's cooking something or whatever, I'll get it. But I'm only going to get one, or I might even, sometimes I've even gotten like the little one, just, why? Because I am putting a judgment of how much worth and how much value that jug of milk actually is worth. And it's in that light that I think Jesus is really speaking, that when we turn to our brother, or we turn to a coworker, it can be in the church, out of the church, but when we turn to that person and we're no longer talking about the action or the inaction that's been completed or not completed, but we turn it and we're now putting a value, a number on that person, well, that is when we are in error. All right, so I was nerding out, and some of the guys know this. I do like these fantasy football drafts. I love them. It's kind of my thing. I love it. Anyway, so I was doing this one. It was an auction draft, which is super I'll be quick with it. Basically, you got 300 fake dollars and you got to get 22 guys. And so it makes you put a value on every player. And so you're kind of saying, well, these players are in kind of the $20 range and all that. That's the form of judgment that Jesus is condemning. Now, not in a fantasy football draft. But if I look at Rusty and I'm like, oh, Rusty, yeah, I know your kind. I know your type. I know who you are. And I'm placing this massive critical value judgment on who Rusty is. Well, now I've taken it too far. Now I've gone that extra bit, and that's no good. And when you think about it, this is exactly what the Pharisees were doing. And the more I learn about this group, the Essenes, this is exactly what the Essenes were doing. That it was commonplace for them to look at a subset of people and say, this is your value. Okay? So they look at the sinner and they say, this is your value. We will not enter your home because you are in this group. We will not share a meal with you because you live in this country, or this is your bloodline. And it actually kind of fits in very well with all kind of the racial tensions that we're talking about here. Jesus is this is a prejudicial type of thing where he's saying, listen, you don't look at somebody, even when they're done wrong, and you assign a value. You assign kind of what their worth is. You have gone too far. You're stepping on God's toes now, because that is not how God sees them, and you are identifying them in a way that God does not identify them. And so I hope that makes sense, that we cannot look at groups of people or even individuals and just write them off and say, no, you're this, you're that. I want nothing to do with you. That is, we become the Pharisee when we do that. Getting real, I think we in the church, right or wrong, I think we have some elitism that goes on within our church. I really do. I think that. And I don't know exactly what to do with all that. What do I mean by elitism? I know for me, it's real easy for me to look at another religious person and quickly dismiss them. You know what I mean? Like, oh, you're this. Oh, you're, and I, I do kind of think, ooh, wait a second. That might be a little too much. And I guess I'd say this, there are people that are right with God and there are people that are not right with God. There are people that are going to heaven and there's people that are not going to heaven. And I'm not saying it's wrong to make that distinction, especially when you look at scriptures. Paul had no problem getting up in front of the Areopagus and saying, listen, like, you guys are all wrong. By the time, he gets up and he's like, you worship an unknown God. Let me tell you about the real God. I think that's cool. Like, he's got conviction. I think where it crosses the line is when we look down on the person themselves based on what they believe. And now, again, we're putting that value on them that they are less than us. They are worse than us. They are, hopefully that makes sense. And so with Jesus, again, I keep saying it again, Jesus is talking about value. And again, speaking of getting real, so here's kind of how this breaks down. I got bad news for you. If you are a Christian, you have a reputation. Now, you may deserve this reputation. You hopefully do not deserve this reputation. But the non-Christians in our world today, they have labeled you. They've actually put a judgment on you, okay? And there's this group, it's called Barna. It's a research institute, but they really focus on churches. And they do all kinds of different studies and polls and whatnot. And they put out a poll, and they wanted to know, what do non-Christians, people who do not associate with Christianity, what is their view of Christians? And they asked them to give them a number of words that would describe them, okay? And here's the top three. You ready? It's not super flattering, so just brace yourself. But again, this is the non-Christian American saying, this is what I think of, this is what I think about Christian Americans. The number one word they used to describe Christians was judgmental. The number two word was hypocritical. And the number three word was, or I guess a phrase, is that they're anti-gay. Okay? So in the non-Christian's mind, this is who you are. The non-Christian is going to look at you, or at least look at our group, and going to say, you guys are super judgmental. you guys are hypocrites. You're hypocritical. You don't practice what you preach. And you guys hate gay people. And like, they probably don't want to become us if that's their viewpoint of us. And again, that's talking about Christianity at large. I'm not talking about this particular group or this particular church. But you understand, Christianity has done a very poor job of executing Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. If we're not to be these judgmental people, this is the number one thing that people think of Christians that are out there. And so I have a question for you. And the question is this: do you contribute to this perception, or do you break this perception? Are you known as a friend of the modern day sinner and tax collector? Or do you look down your nose at them as the Pharisee did? Are you a man of love, of grace, and of compassion? Are you a man that's willing to get off of his high horse to associate with people that don't share your beliefs or your moral stances? Or do you enjoy that high horse? Do you enjoy looking down your nose? Do you enjoy being around a fellowship and just being around other people that are kind of that way? Like, there is something that feels good about feeling elite. Do you revel in that elite type of feeling? And I think, I guess what I'm trying to get across here is that, guys, we got to be loving people. Like, we have got to be so unbelievably loving. When we walk into work, the coworkers should be saying, that's the most loving guy in this entire office. Out of all the cubicles, that's the guy I know I can go and talk to. Do you have that reputation? Or are you the standoffish guy that keeps correcting people whenever they slip up and swear? We got to make sure that we are loving towards people, even if they aren't of the same faith. And so the question comes, well, is Jesus talking here with his do not judge by this, or by that measure it'll be used to you? Or is he talking about judging sinners, or is he talking about Christians? And actually the next two paragraphs answer that question, and the question is both. The answer rather is both. And so let's pick it up here in verse 3, and he's going to go after the brothers. He's going to go after those of the similar faith. And he says, why do you look at a speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. And so this paragraph actually is talking about, whether it's Jew to Jew or in our context, Christian to Christian, this is actually talking about the judgment that can take place between two Christians. And, the obvious part of this passage is the hypocrisy. And he paints this just ridiculous picture of, a guy's got a speck of sawdust. When you got like a speck, you got to like do one of these and look at it and try to find it and flush it out. Well, he's comparing that little tiny speck to a plank, like a 2x4. It's just sticking out of your eye. Like, okay, this is pretty ridiculous here. But what he's saying here, of course, is, guys, before you're going to go after that speck of sawdust, again, get off that high horse, actually look yourself in the mirror, and get rid of that gigantic thing that's in your life. He's saying you got to check yourself here. Check yourself at the door before you walk into that D time. Because when you walk into that D time, when I say D time, I mean like discipling time, where you're going to like talk to somebody about their sin. If you aren't acutely aware of your own sin, then there's a chance that is not going to actually be helpful in that situation. Okay? So check this out. He's saying when we take the plank out and then remove the speck, that is helpful. It's actually helpful to two people. But when we keep the plank and remove the speck, that's hurtful. When we take the plank out and we remove the speck, that brings healing. When we keep the plank in and we remove the speck, that brings hurting. And so Jesus is saying, hey, before you go in there and go after that speck, you better be looking yourself here in the mirror. You've got to look at yourself and be aware of what you're struggling with. Change what you can change so that you can do that. And, when you think about it, something very interesting happens when you have a plank in your eye. So if I have this giant plank sticking out of my eye here, okay, and I claim that I can see sawdust, one piece of sawdust in someone else's eye, you know what makes it really hard to see sawdust in someone's eye? When a 2x4 is coming out of my own eye. Like, it's in the way. And Jesus is saying, maybe your perception of that sawdust isn't actually right. But the only way you're really going to know is you've got to take that massive plank out there. Sometimes we misread the situation. We're in our own sin. We see something and we misread it. We mishear that text, or we mishear that tone, or we don't have all these things, or we see an action and then immediately throw on judgment on top of that. Well, this is why they did it, and they're this type of person. It's hard to do that. It's hard to see when you have a plank sticking out of your eye. And so we've got to take that plank out. Now, the mistake that we can sometimes make when you hear a message like this is you say, okay, well, you know what? I'm just never going to mention anybody's sawdust, because if I go after anybody else, then they can come after me. Bag it, fine. You just stay with your little sawdust. But I want you to notice how this paragraph ends. Here's how it doesn't end. It does not end by saying, since you have a plank in your eye, just walk away from that person because you have no right to say anything. No. It doesn't say that. In fact, if you go back, it actually does tell us to go and to remove that speck. So the judgment isn't Jesus is not advocating, hey, everybody just keep it to yourself. Like, nobody step on each other's toes. Nobody try to remove anybody's plank. No. He wants you to remove that plank. He's just making sure you get your heart right before you do that. And when we do that, like I said, it's not just the one person who gets changed. It's two people that get changed. If I go after you, I got to go look at my own heart before I come after you. Now I'm changing. Now I help you to change, and it's a beautiful thing. I want you to notice one other thing. And here, we're going to go a little beneath the surface here. You ready? What body part is Jesus talking about here? What body part? I don't know why I'm asking you questions. I'm talking to, you guys are all on mute, but okay. He's talking about the eye. Now, can anybody think back to Matthew chapter 6? Did he mention anything about eyes back in Matthew chapter 6? Why, yes, he did. And we talked all about this idea of having the generous eye versus having the stingy eye. The generous eye is the one that wants to love and wants to give and wants to take care of people. The stingy eye is concerned about himself and doesn't really care about the other person. And I want you to think about this. Could this potentially, is there a connection here? Do you think Jesus might have done this on purpose? And I absolutely think that he did. Because if we're the type of people, when we interact with people and we're looking at people with a generous eye, you know what that does? The generous eye is the loving eye that gives people that benefit of the doubt. Does that make sense? When I look on somebody generously or favorably, I'm more likely going to find the good inside of them than the evil. And I remember being back in Toledo, there's a brother named Doug. I love this guy to death, but he was like, this one is really, really discerning, but he was always so negative. Well, he worked at a prison, and he was the drug treatment specialist at this prison. And it's actually kind of a cool place. I went and preached there a few times. But you could actually get a year removed off of your sentence if you completed his program. And so he was constantly dealing with people that were in a drug treatment program but had no interest in changing. And so just being in that prison as much as well, it skewed him. And so anytime he looked at anyone, he just had this it wasn't a generous eye at all. Being a Bible study with somebody, it would go great and be like, that guy's fake. There's no way he's going to make it. That guy's this, he's that. Like, bro, man, you got to stop thinking like this. Anyway, when you look at your neighbor, when you look at your coworker, when you look at even the person that you don't really care about all that much in the office, are you looking at them through a generous eye? Or is the plank the one that's in the generous eye? Are you looking through the generous eye and saying, I am going to show this person love. I am going to be generous with this person. I am going to be loving and kind. And this needs to be the Christian's reputation. Oh, you know what? I missed a cool little story. Let me circle back. So there was a time when we were in Worcester. There's this girl at Worcester State University. She became a Christian. And she was a young Christian, and her best friend was a guy who was homosexual. And she spent just tons and tons of time with him. And it was actually, she was kind of wrestling through that as she studied the Bible. But she became a disciple. And we would see a lot of this guy. And my wife would see him more than anybody because she would go and spend time with her on campus and whatnot. And then maybe after a month or two, the guy said something to my wife that was really, really powerful. And he said, "You're the first Christian to be nice to me." Ooh, let that sink in for a second. You're the first Christian to be nice to me. And so it kind of goes back to that whole kind of like anti-gay, hypocritical, judgmental. This is the reputation, like it or not, that you're getting lumped in with. And it's just so important that we make it our business to eradicate that. Not for the sake of eradicating it, but just because we want to be like Jesus. Like I could never think of somebody looking at Jesus and being like, "You judgmental, you're anti-gay, just don't sense that." The sinners of the day, the prostitutes and the tax collector, all these people, they loved Jesus. I just think we gotta change our viewpoint here a little bit. And I'm not saying we get soft on sin, but you gotta love people. I guess that's what we're saying here, right? It's all about love, it's all about people, and it's all about loving people. This is who Jesus wants us to be. Okay, let's finish this off here. So in verse 3-5, he talks about, the judgment that can go on within the church, that we are actually to do that and to pick the sawdust out of our brother's eye. That's okay. We just got to check our own heart. But we are to do that. We are to be a discipling movement, a discipling church. That's good. But what about the non-Christians? And we're going to go to a real brutal sentence here. You ready? Real brutal sentence. Verse 6. "Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and tear you to pieces." Last time I checked, human beings do not like being compared to animals. It just does not go, that's not good, okay? And so Jesus is like, "Do not judge." And then he turns around and he calls people dogs and pigs. Like, what is going on here? And again, kind of beneath the surface here, when you look at this terminology, it's important to note that this was common terminology that was used during the day. Okay, Jews they did not eat pork. They were not with the pigs. The pigs that was like the main export of the Decapolis, which is on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Those were the pagan people. And so to call them pigs, as evil as that sounds, that was actually kind of the vernacular. The Samaritans, and there's a story of a Syrophoenician woman. She actually, in that story, in that interaction with Jesus, she looks at Jesus. Jesus says, "Listen, we don't give the dogs, the scraps from the table." And she said, "Even the dogs will eat the scraps from your table." Like, she calls herself a dog in that particular thing. So it seems super offensive. It might have been a little offensive, but it probably wasn't quite as offensive as we're meaning it to be. But in both those things, dogs represented the Syrophoenicians and the Samaritans and that group. The pigs represented people that dealt with the pigs, Decapolis. These are non-Christians. These are non-Jews that he's talking about. And so Jesus is actually talking here about, well, what do we do with this whole judging thing of these people that are not of the same faith? And he says, listen, you don't give them what is sacred. So if I took a nice pearl necklace and I presented it to my dog, okay, and I also presented one piece of kibble that would cost me about 0.5 cents. And so I've got maybe a $5,000 thing of jewelry and a 1 cent piece of kibble. Guess what my dog's gonna take? He's taking the kibble. He didn't care about that. And so he's saying, you don't give the dog what they don't want. This doesn't make any sense. You don't give them something that you value that they don't value. All right, so how do we make sense of this? I think sometimes the mistake that we make So let me back up here. Whenever I've taught this, it's kind of like, don't give your pearls to pigs. If somebody's not open, don't waste your time with that person. And I've actually kind of turned it into more of kind of an unloving statement. But honestly, I think I kind of butchered that. I think what Jesus is saying is this, listen, if you've got something that's valuable to you, but it's not valuable to them, then don't give it to them. Don't hold them to that. If you're a Jew and you're trying to hold someone to a Jewish standard and they're not Jewish, what are we doing here? Like, why are you going to tell the Roman soldier that he should be holding to the Sabbath? Like, dude, that's not their law. Like, that's not their rule. Like, no, that's just, it doesn't compute. It makes no sense. And I think where this applies is, so you've got that coworker, right? And he's got that filthy language. He's just got that filthy language. I sometimes think that we think it's our duty to go all John the Baptist on him and just, how dare you use such crude language? You know, we probably don't make it seem like that, but you know what I mean. That we actually start to think that it's our job to disciple and to correct the non-Christian because he's not holding to Christian values. And that doesn't make any sense. That's giving a pearl to a pig. That's saying, why are we holding somebody to a standard that they have never agreed to themselves? Now, you can have a private conversation, say, I don't feel comfortable with that. That's fine. But I sometimes think we're up on our high horse and we think we're the moral police. And that anybody that comes into our thing, that we have got to tell them what God thinks of that particular sin that they're in. And I think the teaching from Jesus is, no, you don't. Like, no, you don't. You don't. You're not required to do that. In fact, you don't want to do that. Because if you do that, you're holding them to a standard that they never agreed to in the first place. And what are they going to do? They're going to trample on it. They're going to put it under your feet. They're going to tear you to pieces. That's where you're getting this, you judgmental person. How dare you tell me what's right and wrong? And you think you have all the answers. In other words, we put ourselves in that predicament when we start becoming the moral police and saying, listen, we're going to give these pearls. We're going to give these pearls. And pearls actually represent kind of strings of truth. That I won't get into all that, but that's actually another thing. But when we try to string these pearls and give all this truth and we try to put it over, our neighbor's head, God's like, no, there's not a time for that. What you need to do is you need to love that person. You need to love that person unconditionally. You need to show favor to them. You need to care about them. You need to celebrate with them. You need to win them over. You need to love people to win them over. And when that time comes, and as he's already said, let your light shine before men that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. That's when you show them who God is, and that's when they'll be open and potentially open to what the scriptures have to say. So there you have it, guys. Judge not, or you too will be judged. What are some concluding points here? Let's make sure we're not using this as our defense mechanism. Do not come to me if I try to help you. You're judging me. Like, hey, no. I'm called to judge you, and you're called to judge me. Now, help me make sure I don't want my plank in that eye or whatever. But let's not use this as defensiveness. Let's make sure that we are judging each other in the appropriate setting. But let's make sure that we're definitely not judging those outside the church and holding them to the standard that we don't have, or that we keep, but they've never agreed to. So with that, thanks so much for visiting us, the Cleveland Church. It's on to discussion.